15. The Tempest and the School Teapot, Part 3. Mr. Phillips' brief reforming energy was over. He didn't want the bother of punishing a dozen pupils, but it was necessary to do something to save his word. So he looked about for a scapegoat and found it in Anne, who had dropped into her seat, gasping for breath, and her forgotten lily leaf hanging askew over one ear, and giving her a particularly rakish and dishevelled appearance. Anne Shirley, since you seem to be so fond of the boys' company, we shall indulge your taste for it this afternoon, he said sarcastically. Take those flowers out of your hair and sit with Gilbert Blythe. The other boys snickered. Diana, turning pale with pity, plucked a wreath from Anne's hair and squeezed her hand. Anne stared at the master as if turned to stone. "Did you hear what I said, Anne?" queried Mr. Phillips sternly. "Yes, sir," said Anne slowly, "but I didn't suppose you really meant it." "I assure you I did," still with the sarcastic inflection which all the children, and Anne especially, hated. It flicked on the raw. "Obey me at once." For a moment Anne looked as if she meant to disobey. Then, realising that there was no help for it, she rose haughtily, stepped across the aisle, sat down beside Gilbert Blythe, and buried her face in her arms on the desk. Ruby Gillis, who got a glimpse of it as it went down, told the others going home from school that she actually never seen anything like it. It was so white, with awful little red spots in it. To Anne, this was the end of all things. It was bad enough to be singled out for punishment from among a dozen equally guilty ones. It was worse still to be sent to sit with a boy. But that boy should be Gilbert Blythe, who was heaping insult on injury to a degree of utterly unbearable. Anne felt that she could not bear it, and it would be of no use to try. Her whole being seethed with shame and anger and humiliation. At first, the other scholars looked and whispered and giggled and nudged, but as Anne never lifted her head, and as Gilbert worked fractions as if his whole soul was absorbed in them, and them only, they soon returned to their own tasks, and Anne was forgotten. When Mr. Phillips called the history class out, Anne should have gone, but Anne did not move, and Mr. Phillips, who had been writing some verses to Priscilla Priscilla before he called the class, was thinking about an obstinate rhyme still and never missed her. Once, when no one was looking, Gilbert took from his desk a little pink candy heart with a gold motto on it, "You are sweet," and slipped it under the curve of Anne's arm. Whereupon Anne arose, took her pink heart gingerly between the tips of her fingers, dropped it on the floor, and ground it to the powder beneath her heel, and resumed her position without deigning to bestow a glance on Gilbert. When school went out, Anne marched to her desk,
everything.
Ousted.
Miss it out.
Took out everything therein, books and writing tablets, pen and ink, testament and arithmetic, and piled them neatly on her cracked slate. What are you taking all those things home for? Diana wanted to know as soon as they were out on the road. She had not dared to ask the question before. I'm not coming to school any more, said Anne. Diana gasped and stared at Anne to see what she meant. If she meant it. Will Marilla let you stay home, she asked. You'll have to, said Anne. I'll never go to school again with that. I'll never go to school to that man again. Oh, Anne, Diana looked as if she was ready to cry. I do think you're mean. What shall I do? Mr. Phillips will make me sit with that horrid Gertie Pye. I know he will, because she's sitting alone. Do come back, Anne. I'd do almost anything in the world for you, Diana, said Anne sadly. I'd let myself be torn limb from limb if it was to do you any good, but I can't do this, so please don't ask it. You harrow up my very soul. Just think of all the fun you will miss, mourned Diana. We're going to build the loveliest new house down by the brook, and we'll be playing ball next week, and you've never played ball, Anne. It's tremendously exciting. And we're going to learn a new song. Jane Andrews is practicing it up now. And Alice Andrews is going to bring a new Pansy book next week, and we're all going to read it out loud, chapter about down by the brook. And I know you are so fond of reading out loud, Anne. Nothing moved Anne in the least. Her mind was made up. She would not go to school to Mr. Phillips again. She told Marilla so when she got home. Nonsense, said Marilla. It isn't nonsense at all, said Anne, gazing at Marilla with solemn, reproachful eyes. Don't you understand, Marilla? I've been insulted. Insulted, fiddlesticks. You'll go to school tomorrow as usual. Oh, no. Anne shook her head gently. I'm not going back, Marilla. I'll learn my lessons at home, and I'll be as good as I can be, and I'll hold my tongue all the time if it's possible at all. But I will not go to school, I assure you. Marilla saw something remarkably like unyielding stubbornness looking out of Anne's small face. She understood that she would have trouble in overcoming it, but she resolved wisely to say nothing more than just then. I'll run down and see Rachel about it this evening, she thought. There's no use reasoning with Anne now. She's too worked up, and I have an idea. She can be also awful stubborn if she takes the notion. Far as I can make out from a story, Mr. Phillips has been carrying matters with a rather high hand. But it would never do to say to her, I'll just talk it out over with Rachel. She's sent 10 children to school, and she ought to know something about it. She'll have heard the whole story too by this time. Marilla found Mrs. Lynde knitting quilts as industrially and cheerfully as usual. I suppose you know what I've come about, she said, a little shamefacedly. Is that a word?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. Mrs. Rachel nodded. About Anne's fuss in school, I reckon, she said. Tilly Bolter was in on her way home from school and she told me about it. I don't know what to do with her, said Marilla. She declares she will go back to school. I never saw a child so worked up. I've been expecting trouble ever since she started to school. I knew things were going too smooth to last. He's so high-strung. What would you advise, Rachel? Well, since you've asked my advice, Marilla, said Mrs. Lynde amiably. Mrs. Lynde dearly loved to be asked for advice. I just humour her a little at first. That's what I do. It's my belief that Mr. Phillips was in for wrong. Of course, it doesn't do to say so to the children, you know. And of course, he did right to punish her yesterday for giving way to temper, but today it was different. The others who were late should have been punished as well. As that's what. And I don't believe in making for boys sit with girls. Sorry, I got that wrong way round. The girls sit with the boys for punishment. It isn't modest. Tilly Bolter was real didn't I keep on struggling with that word. Indignant. She took Anne's part right through and said all the scholars did too. Anne seems real popular among them somehow. I never thought she'd take with them so well. Then you really think I'd better let her stay home? Said Marilla in amazement. Yes. That is, I wouldn't say school to her again until she said it herself. Depend upon it, Marilla, she'll cool off in a week or so and she'll be ready enough to go back of her own accord. That's what, well, if you let her go back right off, do you know what freak or tantrum she'll take next and make more trouble than ever? The less fuss made, the better, in my opinion. She won't miss much by not going to school. As far as that goes, Mr. Phillip isn't any good at all as a teacher. The order he keeps it is scandalous. That's what. And he neglects the young fry and puts all his time on those big scholars he's getting ready for Queen's. He'd never have got for school for another year if his uncle hadn't been the trustee, for he leads the other two round the nose, that's what. I declare, I don't know what education is in this island is coming to. Mrs. Rachel shook her head, as to say if she were only at the head of the educational system of the province, things would have been much better managed. Oh, Marilla.
Do you need a break?
No. Marilla took. Did I miss a bit?